I'm Francesca Maxime.
And I'm Matt McClure, and this is Currents.
What lies ahead for Catholics and Anglicans after the Vatican's big announcement? A local interfaith expert answers some tough questions. Women's role in the church, different and equal? A writer and author shares her views. And becoming a priest, it's an education.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us this Thursday night. Well, the news hit newswires like a bombshell, and the dust has yet to settle following the Vatican's big announcement. It is putting a structure in place to make it easier for Anglicans to become Catholic.
It was big news, and the decision has brought up a lot of questions, really. So to get some answers, I spoke earlier on in the day with Monsignor Guy Massey. He's the Secretary of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs for the Brooklyn Diocese. Well, Monsignor Massey, thank you so much for being here once again on Currents.
Thank you for the invitation.
We appreciate it. It's kind of becoming almost a regular thing.
Yes.
But we appreciate you coming back. Now, first of all, I just wanted to ask you right out of the gate here what your thoughts are on this, this action by the Vatican earlier in the week.
Well, I think my reaction is mixed. On one level, I think that this is a very big surprise, and a very good move in regarding opening up dialogue in a greater depth with the Anglican Church and also perhaps other churches as we have this quest for Christian unity.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I have a number of questions that this move kind of raises in my mind. The first question I have is, this is not new. We have had Anglican communities or Episcopal communities come into the Roman Catholic Church here in this country, and I believe in Connecticut, where the minister was ordained a priest and he retained his family, he is married, and the Catholic parish that he heads or where he serves is very used to this, and that has worked out just very fine. On the other hand, this is a much broader invitation to people who are not content being in the Anglican Communion because of various stance which the Anglican Church has taken. The ordination of women, the ordination of openly gay men and women to ministry. Now, my question to those who are petitioning for this acceptance, and from what I read, it seems to be many people have petitioned Rome to come back into the Catholic Church.
Sure.
My first question is, why?
Right.
And we have had many notable converts from the Anglican Church. John Henry Newman, who's to be beatified, came into the Catholic Church due to the Oxford movement in the 1850s after studying the patristics and finding his way back to Rome, that there is a connection to Rome as being the Apostolic See. The same is also true for Elizabeth Ann Seton, who is, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, very popular and the founder of the Sisters of Charity. But they came with a faith conviction.
Right.
The group that this is directed to are people who are dissidents in their own community.
Right.
Are they coming because they're angry with their own community so that they could have a church which in some way supports what they think? Or have they discovered the importance of Catholic unity?
Right.
That's my first question. My second question is, how do they do this?
Yeah.
Is there what is the process by which an entire congregation comes into the church?
And it's something, I don't think we really even know yet because
Right.
the Vatican, they've said we're going to announce this process at some point, but
Right.
we haven't really been given any details.
Not yet. But these are questions I think that we need to consider. Do they go through the RCIA? Do they go through a process by which they come into full communion? Since it came out of the Office of Doctrine, it is my understanding that in order for this to happen, those congregations would have to accept all of Catholic doctrine, some of which is diametrically opposed to
Right.
what the Anglican Church taught, etc. How did they dialogue with that? The next area is and this is not new, people coming into the Catholic Church who are clergy people come in with their wives and children.
Right.
And retain their status if they wish to be priests, etc. Well,
and some of them too, I should say, bishops as well, maybe in an Anglican communion.
correct.
But they would have to give up that
Sure.
particular title and position to become a Catholic priest,
Correct.
and would not be able to go to the position of a bishop in the
Correct.
Catholic Church.
And they have to be reordained because at the present moment, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't recognize Anglican orders.
Right.
Fine. What happens to the question then of celibacy? Clearly, it's not going to be followed in those coming in unless they choose this, but what about opening that discussion in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
In some cases, I think it is an opening. I think it's good, but it is still an opening to a more conservative understanding of church.
Right.
How do we balance this with people, let's say, whom we might say are a little bit more liberal thinking or have more questions on those who are in the Catholic Church?
Right.
Yeah, I think there has to be discussions on both sides of the fence. I think the most important thing we can do in ecumenical relationships or in situations like this is seek a balance, in the dialogue. And perhaps there are people who might be critical of this move because they're not always seeing that in the church itself at the present moment.
Right. Well, one more quick question here before we have to wrap it up. What effect do you think we might see here locally, if any? I think a lot of people are thinking maybe this is going to be more of a larger movement in Europe, in England, and other places where the Anglican communion is a little bit more conservative. What about here in the States, and particularly in Brooklyn and Queens?
It's very interesting. You know, I haven't heard from any Episcopal communities yet.
Right.
I read that some were taken aback by this and saw it as a big detriment to our dialogue. Others have said, no, this is not a detriment to the dialogue at all. It would be very interesting to see how and what the reaction is on the Episcopal side of, this is the Episcopal Church here, what their take on this, might be.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, we'll have to leave it there. But of course, the dialogue will continue, and the debate will continue on both sides. Monsignor Guy Massey, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Monsignor Guy Massey there, always a pleasure. And to read more about the announcement from the Vatican on Anglican converts, be sure to check out our website. Head to currentsny.net. And one of the issues that Monsignor Massey brought up in that interview was the ordination of women and how that's been an issue for some more conservative Anglicans.
Right, and that's part of the reason why they're doing this. We actually got a woman that we spoke to earlier. She is a theologian, Dr. Pia De Salini. I spoke with her earlier today, and we're going to have that for you coming up straight ahead. And coming up, an armed man enters the store to rob it. You will not believe what happened. We have that and the rest of the day's headlines when Currents returns.
Welcome back to Currents. I'm Matt McClure.
And I'm Francesca Maxime. Coming up a little bit later, we will get an education about what it really takes to be a priest.
But first, let's have a look at the day's headlines. Pro-life members of Congress gathered in Washington yesterday to pressure fellow lawmakers to ban abortion funding in health care reform. Republican leaders say any health care reform legislation that passes must include language prohibiting taxpayer money from being used directly or indirectly for abortions.
Most of the American people have said that we do not want government funding abortion in this country. That's why we're here. This is an issue that is not just a partisan issue. This is an issue that crosses the partisan divide, that the majority of the American people are behind. Abortion is not health care. Government funding of abortion should be excluded from the health care bill.
Currently, the federal government allows government funding for abortions in cases of rape, incest, or the danger to a mother's health. Pro-life advocates, though, have complained that current health care reform proposals under consideration would allow taxpayer funds to be indirectly used to pay for other abortion procedures. Well, 6 of the 9 current Supreme Court justices are Catholic, and one of them, Samuel Alito, says this should not be an area of concern. In a speech earlier this week, Alito also said it's wrong to question whether Catholics on the court can be trusted to do their jobs. Commentators frequently argue Catholics will take the church's view when ruling on issues like abortion. Well, as the Philippines prepares for its 18th typhoon, the church there has issued a prayer for deliverance from major disasters. The church mandated the prayer be read at Mass so the people and their possessions are spared. The typhoon was expected to hit late Thursday evening.
Well, a group that will not be doing any praying is a coalition of atheist organizations that will run ads in New York subway stations. The ad, sponsored by the New York Coalition of Reason, read, "A million New Yorkers are good without God. Are you?" According to the coalition's website, the group promotes, quote, "wider acceptance of a more rational and realistic view of the universe," end quote. The ads will run in 12 subway stations beginning next Monday. Well, prayer may have saved the life of an Indiana woman who was the victim of an armed robber. Reporter Emily Longnecker spoke with the woman who described this remarkable ordeal.
I was like, please don't do this. I have grandbabies, I have family, I have loved ones, and I don't want to die. I don't want to die.
You can't hear Angie Montes begging for her life in this surveillance video during Monday's armed robbery at Advance America Loan Store on East Street.
He said, ma'am, I don't want to do this either. He said, times are bad, times are really hard.
But the silent pictures show something police say they've never seen.
I said, you don't have to do anything like this. I said, don't lower yourself to something so bad.
The suspect, 23-year-old Gregory Smith, brought to his knees in prayer from his victim's words.
He was heartbroken. He was crying. He told me he didn't want to do this. He said, I've got to have this money by 4 o'clock or I will be on the streets with my baby. He said he'd been looking for a job for months, for 4 months.
Angie says at one point Smith asked for a hug.
I said, I'm so scared, and he's like, no ma'am, no, I'm not going to hurt you, I promise, and then he just cried and hugged me.
Angie says when she thought about dying behind that counter, she thought about how hard she'd already fought to live. She says she had a kidney transplant right here at Methodist Hospital just 6 years ago.
I said, life is so precious, you don't understand. I said, God, give me a transplant, and he give me a second chance at life. I said, God loves you, and you think this is the it, but it's not.
But Angie says she still feared the worst when Smith reached into his pocket and pulled out his gun.
I was like, dear Jesus, please don't let this man hurt me. Please take care of my family. And then he said, no, ma'am, no, I'm not going to. And he said, I'm taking the bullet out. And he gave me the bullet. And he said, ma'am, I'm not going to hurt you. Will you pray with me? I said, yes, I'll pray with you. I prayed with him, and he said he was really sorry. I gave him a hug, and I told him, you go do the right thing. You go do this and be a man. Don't lower yourself to something like this. It's not worth going to prison or jail or dying.
Angie says Smith took her to the bathroom and told her to stay there for 20 minutes. Police say Smith ended up taking $20 from the store and the victim's cell phone. But even after her ordeal, Angie says when she thought about the young man whose name she never got and the 15 minutes they shared, much of it in prayer.
I worried about him all night, and then when I was told that he turned himself in, it was a relief that I know he's okay.
Amazing.
Just blown away by that story.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, she was so good at being able to talk to him, and so remarkable that he connected with her at that level.
Right. It's odd to say this in a situation like that, but it's like they were in the right place at the right time. Maybe, you know, the two correct people came in contact with each other at that moment. Right. And, you know, you think about often how you would react in an emergency situation like that, or in a situation where you're being held up. And who knows, but she luckily had the presence of mind to be that person in that situation.
I think her prayer and her faith is so innate in her.
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously what she had gone through with the kidney transplant and everything, she just automatically thought of that. It wasn't like a stretch, like what do I do to try to, you know, distract him? It was like, you know, please, and let's pray together and whatnot.
And she brought up a very good point too about Respect Life Month, perhaps, because she was like, you know, it's, you know, life is so precious. God's given me all these gifts, and he loves you too. Well, stay tuned. There's much more Currents coming up straight ahead.
Coming up, a scholar shares her surprising views on women's standing in the church.
Well, earlier on in the show, I spoke with Monsignor Guy Massey about the Vatican's announcement to make it easier for Anglicans to enter the Catholic Church.
And one of the issues that has many Anglicans upset is their church's decision to ordain women. To get some insight on the role of women in the Catholic Church, I spoke earlier with Dr. Pia De Seleni. She is an author and a theologian and speaks frequently about women and the Church. Hi, Pia. Thank you so much for joining us today on Currents.
Good to be with you, Francesca. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks. What we're talking about today is the role of women in the Catholic Church. And what is your understanding of the role of women in today's church?
You know, Francesca, I would say contrary to popular perception that the role of women is very diverse and varied. Just a few years ago, the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith came out with a document on the collaboration of men and women in the world. And they said women have a role in every aspect of society. At the close of Vatican II, Paul VI said, the future of the world depends on women. And John Paul II devoted a significant portion of his pontificate to talking about the role of women. And one of the things that he said was we've been freed from or liberated from the box of so-called feminism. So I think, first of all, you can't put the role of women into a box and limit it. And secondly, I think it goes beyond the discussion of priesthood. And unfortunately, most of the discussion centers on priesthood, which is a vocation that very few men are even called to. And so I think we kind of have to look beyond priesthood and look at the larger picture. And we're seeing women assuming more and more positions of leadership and, within dioceses. Women's religious orders, you have to remember, at the turn of the 1900s, were one of the most powerful groups of women in the world. They ran universities, they ran schools, hospitals.
They've always been in very
I think we need to recover some of what's lost, and I think we need to continue growing the possibilities that are out there. I mean, Marianne Glendon was head of the Pontifical Council for Social Sciences. There are these positions are opening up, and I think women are called to participate in many, many different ways. But I don't think that there's a way that you can just put it in a box and say, hey, this is the role of women.
Okay, well, then that's fair. But I do suspect still, though, that a lot of American Catholics do have a hard time understanding the Church's teaching about the all-male priesthood. And, as you sort of alluded to earlier, help us to understand this more. Surely a woman can feel called and have all the same feelings and motivations that a man would have. So if a woman in earnest wants to be a priest as her vocation, why can't she?
Well, as you alluded to, it is a very difficult question. I think part of it is because we haven't had the preliminary conversation that needs to take place. First of all, when we're talking about priesthood, I think people have come to think that it's a symbolic role. We think of it in extreme clerical terms, or we think of it very much in a service role, rather than, well, wait a minute, we have to step back and say, what did Jesus intend here? And the relationship of the priest is, to the church, exactly is that of Christ to the church, which is bridegroom to bride. And that is a very real relationship, and it's one that I don't think we've had enough conversation about. I think it needs to be unpacked, because when the priest stands, when we say he's another Christ, it means that he is actually taking this role of the bridegroom. It means that his sexually differentiated body has a very real significance.
Do you think it would help the vocational crisis if women could be ordained, or no? I don't.
And I think, of course, I think you always have to say, look, when you're looking at a problem, am I going to put a Band-Aid on it, or am I going to go back and, really get to the core of it? It's just like if you've got a house that needs work, right? Are you going to, do some surface repairs to it and try to get by and add some other things?
Yeah.
Or are you just going to gut it and then build it back up?
Okay.
And I think that's what John Paul II was doing, and that's why there were so many men answering these calls to the priesthood. I mean, I went to school with a man in Rome, and he was a priest with the Missionaries of Charity, and I asked him about his vocation. I said, how did you know? And he said, I wasn't even a practicing Catholic. He said, I saw John Paul II when he visited Costa Rica, and he said, I saw him, and I knew.
Right.
And I think we have to get back to what's authentic. We're not going to fix the priesthood by simply coming up with some stopgap solutions. And at the same token, I think that we're ignoring what it is that women can do. We're still talking about a woman's vocation in terms of a man's vocation.
Yeah, okay.
And there just needs to be so much more conversation about the first part.
All right, that's fair enough. Now, the Catholic Church has also made a recent, some would say, an historic overture to disaffected Anglicans who are unhappy with, among other things, the ordination of women priests in the Anglican Church. So would the same fate await the Catholic Church if it ever moved in that direction? And what is the decision saying about our own church's teachings about women and the Anglican Church's ideas?
Well, I don't think the Catholic Church is ever going to move in that direction. There was a document, I think in '94, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, on the ordination of priests that John Paul II put out. And, I like to say it was disappointingly short. We were all looking for some massive tome just tearing this apart. And it was just a few pages and basically said, look, we've already looked at this question. We don't have the power to change this. And that is because when we're talking about sacraments, again, this gets kind of heavy, it gets kind of theological, that when you're talking about sacraments, the sign of and the thing signified are the same thing. And the church doesn't have the power to change the sacraments, what they signify. So this is something the church simply does not have the power to change. And some people say, well, it was cultural. And I say, you know what, let's look at the gospel. I mean, Jesus broke culture, broke tradition all the time, but he didn't on this one point. And I think we have to look and step back and say, well, wait a minute, let's see if we can understand it. And that's where I think we need further study and conversation.
All right, Pia. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Currents today. That's all we have time for, but a very interesting discussion, and I'm glad you were here to join us for it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So what do you think?
Well, definitely it's a debate that's going to continue going on. I mean, as we were talking about earlier, what led into all this was the discussion of the ordination of women priests in the Anglican Communion, which is not the only place that takes place. I mean, several Protestant denominations allow that. So, I mean, I don't know. It's one of those things where I don't think, as she mentioned, that there is any change coming.
Yeah.
But, and then again, there are a lot of Anglican priests who are married, which opens up another bag of worms that are going to be coming into the church. But they're coming from a place where the ordination of women may or may not have been allowed.
Right. What I find interesting about what she had to say is that she was sort of trying to harken back to a time and a place early on where there are roles for women and there should still be roles for women, and she believes that those roles for women need to be more dutifully fulfilled in lieu of any desire or need to be have women ordained as priests. So she says, there's stuff that women can do, find out what it is, do it, and don't just make this an argument just about women being ordained as priests. That's, I think, her perspective. Well, stay tuned. There's much more Currents straight ahead.
Coming up, what does it take to make a priest? We'll take a look.
Finally tonight, this is the year for priests, and one of the things the church is hoping to do is to increase vocations.
But what does it take to be a priest? Well, we get some answers in this report from H2O News.
The Year for Priests, promulgated by Benedict XVI, is linked to the diligent work undertaken by the Congregation for Catholic Education. We had already begun a few years ago to reflect on formation. The best seminary, you asked me, what is the best seminary? The best seminary is one that welcomes the seminarians, the young candidates, just the way they are nowadays when they come to the seminary, and one that provides education just as the Church desires. The formation of the new generations is a great hope for priestly vocations throughout the whole world. The profile of young people is often the same. They are generous, they love Christ, and they want to follow Him. But they do not live the Christian culture. They still need to discover the Christian culture and faith. To acquire this basic formation, the Catechism of the Catholic Church and the figure of Saint Jean-Marie Vianney are presented as valuable examples for this day and age. The Curé of Ars lived just after the French Revolution. The Holy Father mentioned this recently. In some way, the church needed to be rebuilt since the grounds had been completely destroyed. Hard work, the priest's renewal of their inner life, Mass and confession are all indispensable tasks. For this reason, the Congregation for Catholic Education has decided to publish a special letter during the Year for Priests. It is a brief text that gives strength to everyone. To the teachers, because they have a lot to adapt to and we want to encourage them. And also for those who have just arrived, in order to tell them, listen, you are lucky to have been chosen as priests. It is an honor, and you should be proud. In a word, it is a blessing to be a priest. It is a blessing to be formed in order to become a priest.
Beginning another life there, but you know, I mean, I'm telling you, the priesthood is a very special calling, and despite all the debate, of course, that takes place, the priesthood is obviously a very special calling, and that was kind of takes me back to the Project Andrew thing that I did last week.
Yeah.
And young men trying to discern that call, it's a very difficult thing to do.
It's a challenge, or it's not. Like the person who was in that other piece that said he was in Costa Rica,
right.
And you know, just he knew
he
wasn't even
after
Catholic.
Hearing the Pope, right.
So it was just. I think it's one of those things that it can either be really a struggle, or it's just like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm telling you, we've been on top of this this Year for Priests thing,
yeah.
And that's no different because coming up on tomorrow's edition of Currents, we'll actually be looking ahead to World Priest Day on Sunday, and we'll hear some very personal and revealing reflections from our very own Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio.
And we'll also visit the John Paul II House of Discernment here in Brooklyn, in the Brooklyn Diocese. We have all that and more on a very special edition of Currents, all devoted to the priesthood.
But until then, remember, you can always watch us online. CurrentsNY.net is the web address.
And you can also keep up with us on Facebook. Just head right on over to facebook.com/currentsny, and you can see our videos and read about some of the topics that we're writing about and all that kind of stuff. So for all of us here at Currents, I'm Francesca Maxime.
And I'm Matt McClure. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great night.